Hey there, Val here. As promised in my last, I know, very brief installment of this winecast about an odd pink grape, I hereby offer you, in honor of Burns Night, a ditty from the archives. First, what is Burns Night? Burns Night is a Scottish celebration held every January 25th. It honors the birthday of Robert Burns, born in 1759, died in 1796, Scotland's national poet. Think of it as a cultural party that combines poetry, traditional food, and plenty of whiskey. That's whiskey with a Y. The evening typically centers around a Burns supper, which follows a specific format. Guests gather for a meal featuring haggis, which is a traditional Scottish dish made from sheep's offal, oats, and spices, which is ceremoniously brought in to the sound of bagpipes. Before anyone eats it, someone recites Burns's poem, Address to a Haggis, a humorous ode that treats the humble dish like a conquering hero. Throughout the night, people share Burns's poetry, and he wrote in a Scottish dialect, so it sounds wonderfully musical and sometimes baffling. People give toasts. They enjoy traditional Scottish food and drink. And the most famous toast is to the immortal memory of Burns himself. You'll also hear Auld Lang Syne, yes, that New Year's Eve song, which Burns wrote. So while it started in Scotland, Burns Night is now celebrated worldwide wherever Scottish communities gather or wherever people appreciate good poetry, hearty food, and an excellent excuse to enjoy some whiskey. So before you crack open that bottle of scotch this January 25th, join us for a dram of knowledge about whiskey and Scotland's most beloved bard. In this episode I'm re-releasing today, I discuss whiskey, what it is, a little history, distinguishing between some styles, and a little silliness because your host cannot help herself, which is just the thing for a cold January in the Northern Hemisphere on this weird third rock from the sun. I hope you enjoy this, and happy Burns Night! Welcome to Glass in Session. I'm your host, Val. Thank you for joining me. This episode airs a few days after an annual celebration known as Burns Night, which I'd never really paid close attention to before. Burns Night, I'm assuming, is different than Burning Man, but I really don't know exactly what Burning Man is, but here we go. First of all, one of the reasons I've never paid attention to Burns Night, I'm not Scottish, but this celebration apparently happens around the world, and I do like me some scotch. Burns Night involves bagpipes and kilts and scotch, all things that I don't have a problem with. There is the eating of the haggis, and I will tell you, the last time I ate haggis, which I believe is a stuffed sheep's stomach, it was about 30 years ago when I lived in England. I had this neighbor who was a wizzo. We called him a weapons systems officer, I believe, on F-111s, which those are all now in the boneyard. But I remember after that party waking up on a very fuzzy carpeted kitchen floor in my English kitchen, because the night before, we centered our celebrations around building a Stonehenge out of beer cans. We wore drinking hats with horns. We sacrificed a plastic cow, as there were no virgins available. And we did all of this under the watchful gaze of a velvet Elvis, a very large velvet Elvis. But I had no idea that these Burns Night festivities centered around one each Robert Burns, who was an 18th century poet, and he was most known for writing the New Year's Eve classic Auld Lang Syne. Mr. Burns passed away at the very young age of 37 years old in 1796, but he had made quite the name for himself for writing what they called downright raunchy filth, complete with pissing on graves and the use of a four-letter C word, which I'm not going to say here. But the Burns Night celebration lives on to this day. I believe it was first launched in the early 1800s, but the Burns Night celebration on January 25th every year involves, nope, not a Beerhenge, but bagpipes and scotch, as I mentioned. Instead of a velvet Elvis and drinking hats, there is the reading of the poem called Ode to a Haggis, along with kilts and much whiskey. So there we are with the haggis. And how we have reached Season 9 of Glass in Session and have not had a whiskey sesh yet is beyond me. I think because it's a very big topic, and every time I sat down to write it, it was just trying to narrow down what we want to shove into a 20-minute episode is very, very difficult. So what I thought we'd do is start today with an overview and then follow up on different countries and styles in subsequent episodes. How does that sound? I will say that in writing this episode, I noticed there are a plethora of other four-letter words involved in the production of whiskey, not the C one, unless we're talking about corn, but none of these words are filthy or raunchy, nor will they earn me an explicit rating on Apple, so thank you very much. It also seems fair that we launch a whiskey discussion in honor of Burns Night, which was this past week. So pour yourself a dram of what Burns would call John Barleycorn whiskey, and let's dig into one of my favorite spirits. First, what is it? I've mentioned before that whiskey can roughly and very generally be described as a distilled spirit made from fermented grain or cereal. In fact, I think my exact words were to think of it as distilled beer. Such as grape brandy can be thought of as distilled wine, and apple brandy can be thought of as distilled cider. It's just kind of a simple way of putting it, but there's so much more to it. Or there wouldn't be over 30 different bottles of the stuff open in my bar right now at this very minute. Whiskey is made around the world, so the definitions are going to vary slightly with respect to several things. For one, different grains and cereals are used depending on the style, the country, the production laws, all those things. Barley and corn, those are the most common. You'll find wheat and rye. I've heard of oats and quinoa being used and other things, but the main ones are barley, corn, wheat, and rye. Those are the ones you're going to hear about the most. And like I said, production is going to vary depending on what kind of still the producer uses, how long they age it, what kind of barrels, what are the laws, etc. And of course, the producer's desired finish style. Go figure. They are all different. Whiskey is not whiskey from one place to another. But we'll kind of shade this sketch in a little bit as we go, but just in pencil. Like I said, we'll do the magic marker episodes in future episodes as far as, a whole episode on Scotch, a whole episode on bourbon, a whole episode on Irish whiskey, Japanese whiskey, because they all really deserve their own little episode. So let's start with some history. Distilling grains into spirits predates any written references to whiskey, but credit for distinguishing the spirit is somewhere between Ireland and Scotland as far as we know. There is still much debate on this, with references dating back to the 15th century, but the first written evidence is from Scotland. As for the word whiskey, its origins are also batted back and forth between the Irish Celtic Uisceba and the Scottish Celtic Uisceba, and I'm not going to spell them because they're very close to each other. But this is their version of what we've called water of life in the past. We've used that before in reference to other distilled spirits, but since then it's been anglicized to what we now call whiskey. And before we go on, we have to address the E-shaped elephant in the room. Is whiskey spelled with an E or no E? Some people spell it W-H-I-S-K-Y. Some people spell it W-H-I-S-K-E-Y. Well, it depends. I was trained that countries with the E in the name, like Ireland or these here United States, will spell whiskey with an E. Countries like Scotland, Japan, and Canada tend to leave the E off. Sounds like a simple enough rule, but let me tell you, I've seen exceptions, and I've seen exceptions around the world. I've heard lore that there was once a desire for the Irish to distinguish their whiskey from Scotch once it all started hitting American soil. But when I looked in the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails, there was nothing predating mid-20th century as far as this naming convention thing. Bottom line, both are correct here in the United States, and there have been exceptions to this rule, like I said, around the world. So if you're writing a book on it, or for me, I go back and forth while I'm writing the podcast, it is easy to pick one spelling for consistency. Dave Broom in his World Atlas of Whiskey, and the authors of the Oxford Companion, David Wondrich and Noah Rothbaum, I think there was a forward in there by David Broom, and even my favorite whiskey podcast, Whiskey Cast, they all leave the E off. Michael Jackson, nope, not that one. Michael Jackson is the author of Whiskey, the Definitive World Guide, and J. Nickles, the author of the Society of Wine Educators Certified Specialist of Spirits Study Guide, my favorite spirits book. They keep the E on for consistency, unless referring to a producer's particular product. I have no idea what I'm naming this podcast yet, so have at it. But where was I? Uisceba. So the beginning of whiskey as we know it was in the Ireland, Scotland realm up there, but each region is going to have their own history and how their whiskey styles developed through the years. And those are the things we can touch on in those what I call the magic marker episodes in the future. But back to the colored pencils we go. Whiskey around the world. No doubt you've heard the big words, bourbon, Scotch, rye, whiskey. Those are the big ones. And those, I think, are confusing. And so what I hope to do today is kind of square those away for you. Let's start with the obvious, where whiskey started. Scotchy, Scotch, Scotch, Scotch. Scotch only comes from Scotland. Easy, end of episode. No, I'm kidding. It is an entire episode unto itself. Like I said, Not all whiskey is Scotch, just like we learned in geometry class. See, Mr. Mecca, I was paying attention 40 years ago. All squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares, am I right? All Scotch is whiskey, but not all whiskey is Scotch. And I say this because I've heard a bunch of lawyers sitting around a podcasting microphone drinking Four Roses bourbon and calling it Scotch. And I'm one of those people that's like, it's not Scotch. But in all fairness, we're talking about lawyers, squared away lawyers, not squares like me who read books and like to take tests on the stuff. Lawyers have better things to do. So Scotch, my friends, comes from Scotland, like I said. Very precise production rules prescribe what legally can be called a Scotch, and there are over 130 distilleries that make the stuff as of the 2020 CSS study guide. Required ingredients consist of simply this: water, malted barley, and any other whole grain or cereal. It has to be fermented, distilled, and aged in Scotland. The fermentation and distilling have to be at the same place, same location. And the aging has to happen in a licensed excise warehouse for at least 3 years in oak. And oh, by the way, the oak barrel cannot exceed 185 gallons or 700 liters. Used bourbon barrels are often the cask of choice. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the only other thing that can be added to your whiskey is a little bit of water and also caramel color for consistency. In other words, if you're looking in front of a wall of whiskey and all the Johnnie Walker bottles aren't the same color as far as the liquid in the bottles, then it doesn't seem to be very appetizing for the consumers. That's really the only reason they do that. There are 5 different categories of Scotch. You may have heard the term single malt. Basically, that's made with barley and is from a single distillery. Single grain is going to be made with barley and other grains, also from a single distillery. Blended malt, 2 or more distilleries are going to have their hand in a finished product, and that is only barley or single malt. And blended grain, again, 2 or more distilleries contributing to the finished product made of at least 2 single grain scotches, and blended Scotch. This is a combination of single malt and single grain whiskeys. This is where the blenders get to really have a good time, and this is going to be about 90% of Scotch consumption around the world. This is also where the producer gets to have a little brand consistency. So your blended Scotch is always going to taste the same every time you go back for that brand. But before we go on, let's go back to that little malt thing. This is an actually very important part of the whiskey making process, no matter where the whiskey comes from. So remember those 4-letter words I mentioned? This is one of them, malt. We're going to talk about kiln, wort, mash, mill, wash, etc. So let's move on to production. Here's the deal on production before we go on to talk about these other countries. Grains, unlike fruits that have readily available sugars for fermentation, grains cannot be fermented right away because they have starches inside the grain. It's kind of like the center of a Tootsie Pop. It's the center of the grain. They've got these protein-lined cell walls keeping those starches prisoner. In order to get to that starchy center, sprouting is encouraged. And so what they do is they soak the grains in water for about 2 to 3 days. The sprouting actually is responsible for the release of an enzyme, a diastase enzyme. There are actually several of them, but I'm not going to go into those. But those are crucial for converting the starches to fermentable simple sugars later. At this point, once the grains have sprouted, and this is what they're calling the malt, the producer will roast the malt, and this is called a kiln process. So we got the kilning of the malt, which is really the roasting of the sprouted barley. And this arrests the germination. And again, this process can differ from region to region because this also gives the producer a chance to add flavoring or peat or what have you. And we'll talk about peat in the Scotch episode because that's another favorite 4-letter word, P-E-A-T, by the way. The roasted malt is then sent to the mill. And so if you've ever heard the expression about something being grist for the mill, this usually refers to something being advantageous. Oh, that's grist for the mill. In this case, it's advantageous for the malt to become grist for the mill, in which case it is ground before it's off to become mash or wort. 2 more 4-letter words. Yes, all of them. Mash is also a noun. It's a verb. It's an adjective. Mash can be that sludgy-looking combination of those ground grains from the mill in hot water. All of this sludge, what's happening in there is those precious starches are being converted into sugar by way of those enzymes. This is the process also called mashing. So the mash is the sludgy stuff that I'm talking about. It's also the process. And mashing happens in a mash cooker or mash tun, depending on where we are in the world. So mash the adjective, mash the verb, mash the noun. Now this mash, or we can call it wort, some people call it different things depending on where they are, it's ready to be fermented in another 4-letter word, wash or beer. Ta-da! You know the rest. That's all there is to it. The beer is distilled into whiskey, again, in a process that differs by region, production laws, and style. We won't get into the heads, tails, cuts, other 4-letter words in this episode since this is an overview, but we all know that after a spirit, whatever spirit is distilled, it goes through a process that involves aging, if applicable, blending, finishing, and bottling. That's it. Irish whiskey. Let's move on to the other countries now. Irish whiskey, which I have 3 different whiskeys in front of me because I couldn't decide, but I like to go back and forth and smell the difference as I'm talking. I've got some Irish whiskey in front of me, and it also has different styles like single malts, grain, blended, but it's the pot still tradition that really attracted me and that distinguishes it as a product category. And that's what I have in front of me right now. I like how Michael Jackson writes about the magic of the Irish pot still and that Irish whiskey is approachable as compared to Scotch. Again, depends on the Scotch. David Broom writes in his book that single pot still is, and I quote, an addictive style. It is seductive. It asks you to linger, whispers, just one more glass in your ear. You succumb. Who couldn't? End quote. My bottle of Yellow Spot would second that motion. Yet this process is regulated in terms of the mash bill and a minimum of 30% of the unmalted barley. In terms of fermentation, the solids are removed from the wort or the mash, so less sludge, more liquid, before being distilled in batches in pot stills. Whoa, Val, you talked about malt for almost 5 minutes. Now what's with the unmalted barley, you might be thinking? Well, there was a tax on malt in the 17th century, so this is how the Irish got smart, started using unmalted barley to get around it. This unmalted barley brings kind of a leathery saddle and some say linseed oil character to the Irish whiskey, but I still find it, in fact, if I'm looking at the 3 glasses, that's the one I've been sipping on the most. And I'll tell you about the other 2 in a minute. Irish whiskey, like Scotch, is still required to be aged in its homeland. So Irish whiskey only can come from Ireland, and it has to be aged also for a minimum of 3 years in wood up to 185 gallons. Irish whiskey can be aged in new barrels as well as port or even bourbon barrels like the Scotch typically uses. But one of my favorites is a redbreast that's aged in barrels that once stored Oloroso sherry. Now, if I mention a brand on this podcast, I am not advertising. If I ever do a sponsored content or a brand promotion, which is very, very rare, but if I ever do, I will definitely let you know, and the podcast will be marked before you even clicked on it. This is not an ad. These are things that I've discovered over the years, usually by listening to Whiskey Cast, which makes me drool, and I've listed them in the show notes, so you can go check them out. I've talked about bourbon barrels, so that's going to bring me to bourbon. How are we doing on time here? Not too bad. This is America's whiskey. It can only be made in America, but most of it is made in Kentucky. When I was in Kentucky for the Society of Wine Educators Bourbon Conference a handful of years ago, we were told that there are more barrels of bourbon aging in the state of Kentucky than there are people living there. In my opinion, that's how it should be. But did you know that instead of mostly barley, like many Scotch and Irish whiskeys, that bourbon must, by law, be made with at least 51% corn? And it's aged in brand new charred American oak barrels. I said brand new. So now you can see why so many other products around the world are aged in bourbon barrels, because you can only use them if they're new. So a lot of them go off to Scotland. A lot of them go to wineries, breweries, other spirit producers. I did a whole episode on bourbon barrels and the aging of products in them. And I also did an episode on wood and particularly oak, why we use oak for maturing spirits. And I've linked both of those up for you. And I should say that bourbon has an incredible history of its own and will earn its own episode in the future as well. But I did link up the Booze Riots episode that talked about the whiskey riots. And that's part of American whiskey history. So I'll let you check that out if you haven't. Some useful terms you may come across with respect to bourbon, including the one I have in front of me, are words like straight bourbon or bottled in bond bourbon. And this one happens to be both. It's called new riff, a new riff on an old tradition. And this one actually has the mash bill, which is like the recipe, if you think about it, right on the back. It's 65% corn, 30% rye, 5% malted barley. As I mentioned, this is not an ad. This is just something I'm enjoying, one of my Christmas gifts that I'm sharing with you. And it's actually the darkest of the 3 whiskeys I have in front of me. So I have the Irish whiskey, like I mentioned, the Yellow Spot in front of me. I have the Indian whiskey, which I'll mention in a minute, in front of me. And then I have this new riff, which is nice, that nice dark color to it. So I mentioned straight bourbon and bottled in bond. Straight bourbon is, you're probably thinking, well, knowing Val, she's drinking it straight out of the bottle. Nope, I don't do that. But straight bourbon actually has to do with aging. to be labeled straight, and that's any kind of American whiskey, whether it's straight rye, straight corn, or any of those things, it had to have aged in those new charred American oak barrels for a minimum of 2 years. However, if it's aged for less than 4 years, then there is a mandatory age requirement on the label. And then if you're dealing with a blended whiskey of any kind, it's going to be the youngest, the age of the youngest, if it's been under 4 years. You know what I'm saying there. Bottled and bond, which is what this one is also. Bottled and bond is enforced under the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. I know I talked about this on Wine to Five back in the day, but that's probably before a lot of you might have found your way to this podcast. I know it's still out there somewhere. And this has to do with ensuring the spirit is unadulterating and storing it in a locked storage facility, a government requirement facility for at least 4 years. And the reason for that was back in the day, people would adulterate their booze or sometimes put dangerous things in them. By coming up with this Bottled and Bond Act, there were requirements that pretty much stated if your spirit, and doesn't have to be whiskey, but if it is bottled and bond and locked into this storage facility 4 years, there are certain requirements here. And that pretty much guarantees that what you're buying means that it was not adulterating. There were no colors, no sweeteners, no flavors, no dilutions, no filtrations. It has to be bottled at 50% alcohol by volume or 100 proof, which is what mine is. And it has to stay there for at least 4 years in this locked facility. It's a little overview. I do have a picture of the text of the law somewhere, which had other little dingleberries in it, like bridges or something or other. But hey, talk about an infrastructure bill. Am I right? Tennessee whiskey, on the other hand, is another American specialty. And according to the CSS study guide, is technically a type of bourbon, which I did not know. I was always told you did not call it that. And if you go to Tennessee, you don't call it that. Although it is like bourbon because it is made with 51% corn, so kind of makes sense. But what distinguishes Tennessee whiskey from the bourbons and the other whiskeys in the US of A is something called the Lincoln County process. This is fascinating to me because this has to do with filtering the whiskey through an often 10-foot deep bed of charcoal from sugar maple charcoal, really. And oh, by the way, this has been required by law since 2013, according to Tennessee House Bill 1084. One distillery was exempted from having to do this, but there's still a lot of strife over this bill. Because think about it, a 10-foot deep bed of maple sugar charcoal, that's going to add to your production costs. And some producers, I don't think really want to do this, but it does add a certain smoothness to the whiskey. I do have the Uncle Nearest. That is probably one of my favorite Tennessee whiskeys. Thing about Tennessee, though, there's still a lot of archaic prohibition, backwards silliness happening in the state that impacts production and sale there. But I think that's a story for another day as well, because I don't want to take away from the quality of the whiskey, just because of state, whatever. But moving on, if you've ever driven your Chevy to the levee only to find out that it was dry, and then you remember the good old boys, they were drinking whiskey and rye, you can thank Don McLean's American Pie for those words, by the way, but that rye is another American specialty. It is a whiskey that is not mostly barley or corn, but you guessed it, rye. And again, like I said, a large part of my bourbon here is rye. It adds a little spiciness, I always think, to the whiskey. One should acknowledge that it was rye that brought American whiskey to the party, in as far as our whiskey history goes. And since that's most of what was made during the 18th century, and again, that Booze Ride episode where they talked about that area in Pennsylvania where I'm from, that's where much of our industry was located back in the day, and it was rye whiskey that gave American whiskey its start. Other American whiskeys, like corn whiskeys or straight whiskeys or white whiskey, blended whiskey, flavored whiskeys, you've seen those. That's something that should be covered again another time, because we do make great whiskey here in Colorado. I have some really nice Wyoming whiskeys, Virginia whiskey from all over the country, really, but we can't do it all in one episode. As I said when I started, whiskey is made around the world. I have a lovely whiskey from India sitting right in front of me. It's an Amaret single malt. I have a single malt from Alsace, France. I have some Canadian whiskey, Japanese whiskey, which also is another great story. It comes in so many styles and different flavor profiles. I think to best appreciate it, it does involve a lot of tasting to see what appeals to you. If you have a nice whiskey bar, a lot of them do offer tastings. And I think it's really great to go to those kind of places, line up a couple in front of you and say, you know what, I'm new to whiskey. I don't even know what I like, but can you pour a couple and maybe talk me through them, or attend a whiskey class, or get yourself this awesome CSS study guide. Again, not an advertisement, but I will tell you, it's my favorite spirits resource because it's all in one place and there are cocktail recipes on the back. Just saying. And Jane does a really good job of explaining the different spirits and the styles and everything. And I think it's an invaluable resource, even if you're not studying for an exam. That brings us to a very good place to stop right here. Again, I know the world of whiskey, wine, spirits, all of these things can be confusing. I'm just here to give you a little taste of it and maybe kind of point you in a direction to just enhance your appreciation of these things a little bit more. Well, here's what I won't do. I will not tell you that you're drinking your whiskey wrong. I never click on these articles as clickbait called, you might be drinking your whiskey wrong, or X, Y, and Z wrong, or you could be doing something wrong. Why would you click on an article like that? I would not. Some like their whiskey neat. Neat pretty much means the way I'm drinking mine right now. They're just a little bit poured in the glass. I'm one of those people. Some people like to add a little water or bloom their scotch, for example. I do that sometimes with some of my scotch. When I was studying for my spirits unit for my wine spirits diploma from WSET, I did cut my spirits because I was tasting so many of them. So I did cut them. And that's how we did it in the exams as well. I did cut them also. Wouldn't wear out my palate. But if I'm sipping, I'm a fan of the neat. I do like a big old ice cube during the warmer weather, but it's got to be like one big, perfectly clear cube or ball or whatever that won't quickly dilute my whiskey. But on the rocks, if that's your thing, that's cool. I like whiskey in my cocktails. I like rye in cocktails like a Manhattan. I like wheat. I have some Colorado wheated whiskey in an old fashioned with black walnut bitters. There's so many ways to enjoy whiskey, whether you're celebrating Burns Night. There are different cocktails out there that they've created in honor of Burns Night. But however you enjoy it, take your cup of kindness yet for Auld Lang Syne, or the good old times, according to Merriam-Webster. However you like it, I will not judge. I will not drink shame. I honor anyone who just wants to try something new. In the meantime, thank you for giving me a spot in your podcast feed this week. I know it's precious real estate. As somebody who has over like 100 podcasts in my feed, I really get it. You don't have time to listen to them all. So if your ears are hearing this right now, I thank you so much. In the meantime, you can always reach out to me via email, val@glassandsession.com, or on the socials, pick your poison, Blue Sky, Glass in Session. Vina with Val on Threads and Instagram. You'll see Glass in Session, trademarked, in my bio. I'm on Spoutable, sometimes, Glass in Session. I'm rarely on Pinterest, but it's Vino with Val, and on Facebook, it's /Glass in Session. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Valerie Caruso is what you'll see in my bio, and you'll see letters and after it, DWS, CWE, FWS, blah, 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 wine stuff, and audiobook narrator, which reminds me you can find this podcast and the latest audiobooks I've narrated on Audible. I will also mention there is Glass in Session swag in my TeePublic store, linked way at the bottom of the show notes and on my website. Thank you to those of you who are supporting the show. Glass in Session is a production and registered trademark of Vina with Val, LLC. Music is Write Your Story by Joy Stock. This week's bourbon segment, Fife and Drum, is by Kevin MacLeod from Incompetech. Licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. Website, glassandsession.com/podcast.